Chapter 18, Part 3 of Volume 2 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Volume 2 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 18, The Kingship in France, Part 3. In 1206 the territorial work of Philip Augustus was well nigh completed, but his wars were not over. John Lackland, when worsted, kicked against the pricks, and was incessantly hankering, in his antagonism to the King of France, after hostile alliances and local conspiracies easy to hatch amongst certain feudal lords discontented with their suzerain. John was on intimate terms with his nephew, Otho IV, Emperor of Germany, and the foe of Philip Augustus, who had supported against him Frederick II, his rival for the empire. They prepared in concert for a grand attack upon the King of France, and they had won over to their coalition some of his most important vassals, amongst others Renaud de Dampierre, Count of Boulogne. Philip determined to divert their attack, whilst anticipating it, by an unexpected enterprise, the invasion of England itself. Circumstances seemed favourable. King John, by his oppression and his perfidy, had drawn upon him the hatred and contempt of his people, and the barons of England, supported and guided by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, had commenced against him the struggle which was to be endured some years afterwards by the forced concession of Magna Charta, that foundation stone of English liberties. John, having been embroiled for 5 years past with the court of Rome, affected to defy the excommunication which the Pope had hurled at him, and of which the King of France had been asked by several prelates of the English Church to ensure the efficient working. On the 8th of April, 1213, Philip convoked, at Soissons, his principal vassals or allies, explained to them the grounds of his design against the King of England, and, by a sort of special confederation, they bound themselves, all of them, to support him. One of the most considerable vassals, however, the sometime regent of France during the minority of Philip, Ferrand, Count of Flanders, did not attend the meeting to which he had been summoned, and declared his intention of taking no part in the war against England. "By all the saints of France," cried Philip, "either France shall become Flanders, or Flanders France." And, all the while pressing forward the equipment of a large fleet collected at Calais for the invasion of England, he entered Flanders, besieged and took several of the richest cities in the country, Cassel, Ypres, Bruges, and Courtrai, and pitched his camp before the walls of Ghent, to lower, as he said, the pride of the men of Ghent and make them bend their necks beneath the yoke of kings. But he heard that John Lackland, after making his peace with the court of Rome through acceptance of all the conditions and all the humiliations it had thought proper to impose upon him, had just landed at Rochelle, and was exciting a serious insurrection amongst the lords of Saintonge and Poitou. At the same time Philip's fleet, having been attacked in Calais roads by that of John, had been half destroyed or captured, and the other half had been forced to take shelter in the harbour of Damme, where it was strictly blockaded. Philip, forthwith adopting a twofold and energetic resolution, ordered his son Philip to go and put down the insurrection of the Poitevins on the banks of the Loire, and himself took in hand the war in Flanders, which was of the most consequence, considering the quality of the foe and the designs they proclaimed. They had at their head the Emperor Otho IV, who had already won the reputation of a brave and able soldier, and they numbered in their ranks several of the greatest lords, German, Flemish, and Dutch, and Hugh de Beauve, the most dreaded of those adventurers in the pay of the wealthy princes, who were known at that time by the name of roadsters, routiers, mercenaries. They proposed, it was said, to dismember France, and a promise to that effect had been made by the Emperor Otho to his principal chieftains assembled in secret conference. "It is against Philip himself, and him alone," he had said to them, "that we must direct all our efforts. It is he who must be slain first of all, for it is he alone who opposes us and makes himself our foe in everything. When he is dead, you will be able to subdue and divide the kingdom according to our pleasure, As for thee, Renaud, thou shalt take Peronne and all Vermandois. Hugh shall be master of Beauvais, Salisbury of Dreux, Conrad of Mantes, together with Vexin, and as for thee, Ferrante, thou shalt have Paris." The two armies marched over the Low Countries and Flanders, seeking out both of them the most favourable position for commencing the attack. On Sunday the 27th of August, 1214, Philip had halted near the bridge of Bouvines, not far from Lille, and was resting under an ash beside a small chapel dedicated to St. Peter. There came running to him a messenger, sent by Guerin, Bishop of Senlis, his confidant in war as well as government, and brought him word that his rearguard, attacked by the Emperor Otho, was not sufficient to resist him. Philip went into the chapel, said a short prayer, and cried as he came out, "Haste we forward to the rescue of our comrades." Then he put on his armour, mounted his horse, and made swiftly for the point of attack, amidst the shouts of all those who were about him, "To arms! To arms!" Both armies numbered in their ranks not only all the feudal chivalry on the two sides, but burgher forces, those from the majority of the great cities of Flanders being for Otho, and those from 16 towns or communes of France for Philip Augustus. It was not, as we have seen, the first time that the forces from the French rural districts had taken part in the king's wars. Louis the Fat had often received their aid against the tyrannical and turbulent lords of his small kingdoms. But since the reign of Louis the Fat the organisation and importance of the communes had made great progress in France, and it was not only rural communes, but considerable cities, such as Amiens, Arras, Beauvais, Compiègne, and Soissons, which sent to the army of Philip Augustus bodies of men in large numbers and ready trained to arms. Contemporary historians put the army of Otho at 100,000, and that of Philip Augustus at from 50 to 60,000 men. But amongst modern historians one of the most eminent, M. Sismondi, reduces them both to some 15 or 20,000. One would say that the reduction is as excessive as the original estimate. However they may be, the communal forces evidently filled an important place in the king's army at Bouvines, and maintained it brilliantly. So soon as Philip had placed himself at the head of the first line of his troops, the men of Soissons, says William the Breton, who was present at the battle, being impatient and inflamed by the words of Bishop Guerin, let out their horses at the full speed of their legs, and attacked the enemy. But the Flemish knights pricked not forward to the encounter, indignant that the first charge against them was not made by knights, as would have been seemly, and remained motionless at their post. The men of Soissons, meanwhile, see no need of dealing softly with them and humouring them, so thrust them roughly, upset them from their horses, slay a many of them, and force them to leave their place or defend themselves, willy-nilly. At last the Chevalier Eustace, scorning the burghers and proud of his illustrious ancestors, moves out into the middle of the plain, and with haughty voice roars, "Death to the French!" The battle soon became general and obstinate. It was a multitude of hand-to-hand fights in the midst of a confused melee. In this melee, the knights of the Emperor Otho did not forget the instructions he had given them before the engagement. They sought out the King of France himself to aim their blows at him, and ere long they knew him by the presence of the royal standard, and made their way almost up to him. The communes, and chiefly those of Corbeil, Amiens, Beauvais, Compiègne, and Arras, thereupon pierced through the battalions of the knights and placed themselves in front of the king, when some German infantry came up round Philip, and with hooks and light lances threw him down from his horse. But a small body of knights who had remained by him overthrew, dispersed, and slew these infantry, and the king, recovering himself more quickly than had been expected, leapt upon another horse, and dashed again into the melee. Then danger threatened the Emperor Otho in his turn. The French drove back those about him, and came right up to him. A sword thrust, delivered with vigour, entered the brain of Otho's horse. The horse, mortally wounded, reared up and turned his head in the direction whence he had come, and the Emperor, thus carried away, showed his back to the French, and was off in full flight. "Ye will see his face no more to-day," said Philip to his followers, and he said truly. In vain did William de Bar, the first knight of his day in strength, and valour, and renown, dash off in pursuit of the Emperor. Twice he was on the point of seizing him, but Otho escaped, thanks to the swiftness of his horse and the great number of his German knights, who, whilst their emperor was flying, were fighting to a miracle. But their bravery saved only their master. The battle of Bouvines was lost for the Anglo-Germano-Flemish coalition. It was still prolonged for several hours, but in the evening it was over, and the prisoners of note were conducted to Philip Augustus. There were 5 counts: Ferrand of Flanders, Renaud of Boulogne, William of Salisbury, a natural brother of King John, Otho of Tecklenburg, and Conrad of Dortmund, and 25 barons, bearing their own standard, to battle. Philip Augustus spared all their lives, sent away the Earl of Salisbury to his brother, confined the Count of Boulogne at Peronne, where he was subjected to very rigorous imprisonment, with chains so short that he could scarce move one step; and as for the Count of Flanders, his sometime regent, Philip dragged him in chains in his train. It is difficult to determine from the evidence of contemporaries which was the more rejoiced at and proud of this victory, king or people. The same day, when evening approached, says William the Breton, the army returned laden with spoils to the camp, and the king, with a heart full of joy and gratitude, offered 1,000 thanksgivings to the Supreme King, who had vouchsafed to him a triumph over so many enemies; and in order that posterity might preserve forever a memorial of so great a success, the Bishop of Senlis founded, outside the walls of that town, a chapel, which he named Victory, and which, endowed with great possessions and having a government according to canonical rule, enjoyed the honour of possessing an abbot and a holy convent. Who can recount, imagine, or set down with a pen, or parchment, or tablets, the cheers of joy, the hymns of triumph, and the numberless dances of the people, the sweet chants of the clergy, the harmonious sounds of warlike instruments, the solemn decorations of the churches inside and out, the streets, the houses, the roads of all the castles and towns, hung with curtains and tapestry of silk and covered with flowers, shrubs, and green branches; all the inhabitants of every sort, sex, and age running from every quarter to see so grand a triumph, peasants and harvesters breaking off their work, hanging round their necks their sickles and hoes, for it was the season of harvest, and throwing themselves in a throng upon the roads to see in irons that Count of Flanders, that Fernand whose arms they had formerly dreaded. It was no groundless joy on the part of the people, and a spontaneous instinct gave them a forecast of the importance of that triumph which elicited their cheers. The battle of Bouvines was not the victory of Philip Augustus alone, over a coalition of foreign princes. The victory was the work of king and people, barons, knights, burghers, and peasants of Ile-de-France, of Orleanness, of Picardy, of Normandy, of Champagne, and of Burgundy; and this union of different classes and different populations in a sentiment, a contest, and a triumph shared in common was a decisive step in the organization and unity of France. The victory of Bouvines marked the commencement of the time at which men might speak, and indeed did speak, by one single name, of the French. The nation in France and the kingship in France on that day rose out of and above the feudal system. Philip Augustus was about the same time apprised of his son Louis's success on the banks of the Loire. The incapacity and swaggering insolence of King John had made all his Poitevin allies disgusted with him. He had been obliged to abandon his attack upon the King of France in the provinces, and the insurrection, growing daily more serious, of the English barons and clergy for the purpose of obtaining Magna Charta was preparing for him other reverses. He had ceased to be a dangerous rival to Philip. No period has had better reason than our own to know how successes and conquests can intoxicate warlike kings. But Philip, whose valour on occasion was second to none, had no actual inclination towards war or towards conquest for the sole pleasure of extending his dominion. Liking better, according to his custom, says William the Breton, to conquer by peace than by war, he hasted to put an end by treaties, truces, or contracts to his quarrels with King John, the Count of Flanders, and the principal lords made prisoner at Bouvines. Discretion in his case was proof against the temptations of circumstances or the promptings of passion, and he took care not to overtly compromise his power, his responsibility, and the honour of his name by enterprises which did not naturally come in his way, or which he considered without chances of success. Whilst still a youth, he had given, in 1191, a sure proof of that self-command which is so rare amongst ambitious princes, by withdrawing from the crusade in which he had been engaged with Richard Coeur de Lion, and it was still more apparent in two great events at the latter end of his reign: the crusade against the Albigensians and his son Louis's expedition in England, the crown of which had, in 1215, been offered to him by the barons at war with King John in defence of Magna Charta. The organisation of the kingdom, the nation, and the kingship of France was not the only great event and the only great achievement of that epoch. At the same time that this political movement was going on in the state, a religious and intellectual ferment was making head in the church and in men's minds. After the conquest of the Gauls by the Franks, the Christian clergy, sole depositaries of all lights to lighten their age, and sole possessors of any idea of opposing the conquerors with arguments other than those of brute force, or of employing towards the vanquished any instrument of subjection other than violence, became the connecting link between the nation of the conquerors and the nation of the conquered, and, in the name of one and the same divine law, enjoined obedience on the subjects, and, in the case of the masters, moderated the transports of power. But in the course of this active and salutary participation in the affairs of the world, the Christian clergy lost somewhat of their primitive and proper character. Religion, in their hands, was a means of power as well as of civilization, and its principal members became rich, and frequently substituted material weapons for the spiritual authority which had originally been their only reliance. When they were in a condition to hold their own against powerful laymen, they frequently adopted the powerful laymen's morals and shared their ignorance. And in the 7th and 8th centuries the barbarism which held the world in its clutches had made inroads upon the Church. Charlemagne essayed to resuscitate dying civilization, and sought amongst the clergy his chief means of success. He founded schools, filled them with students to whom promises of ecclesiastical preferments were held out as rewards of their merit, and, in fine, exerted himself with all his might to restore to the Christian Church her dignity and her influence. When Charlemagne was dead, nearly all his great achievements disappeared in the chaos which came after him. His schools alone survived and preserved certain centres of intellectual activity. When the feudal system had become established, and had introduced some rule into social relations, when the fate of mankind appeared no longer entirely left to the risks of force, intellect once more found some sort of employment, and once more assumed some sort of sway. Active and educated minds once more began to watch with some sort of independence the social facts before their eyes, to stigmatize vices, and to seek for remedies. The spectacle afforded by their age could not fail to strike them. Society, after having made some few strides away from physical chaos, seemed in danger of falling into moral chaos. Morals had sunk far below the laws, and religion was in deplorable contrast to morals. It was not laymen only who abandoned themselves with impunity to every excess of violence and licentiousness. Scandals were frequent amongst the clergy themselves. Bishoprics and other ecclesiastical benefices, publicly sold or left by will, passed down through families from father to son, and from husband to wife, and the possessions of the Church served for dowry to the daughters of bishops. Absolution was at a low quotation in the market, and redemption for sins of the greatest enormity cost scarcely the price of founding a church or a monastery. Horror-stricken at the sight of such corruption in the only things they at the time recognized as holy, men no longer knew where to find the rule of life or the safeguard of conscience. But it is the peculiar and glorious characteristic of Christianity that it is unable to bear for long, without making an effort to check them, the vices it has been unable to prevent, and that it always carries in its womb the vigorous germ of human regeneration. In the midst of their irregularities, the 11th and 12th centuries saw the outbreak of a grand religious, moral, and intellectual fermentation, and it was the Church herself that had the honour and the power of taking the initiative in the Reformation. Under the influence of Gregory VII, the rigour of the popes began to declare itself against the scandals of the episcopate, traffic in ecclesiastical benefices, and the bad morals of the secular clergy. At the same time austere men exerted themselves to rekindle the fervour of monastic life, re-established rigid rules in the cloister, and refilled the monasteries by their preaching and example. Saint Robert of Molesme founded the order of Citeaux, Saint Norbert that of Prémontre. Saint Bernard detached the Clairvaux from Meaux, which he considered too worldly. Saint Bruno built Chartreuse, St. Hugo, St. Gerard, and others besides gave the abbey of Cluny its renown, and ecclesiastical reform extended everywhere. Hereupon rich and powerful laymen, filled with ardour for their faith and fear for their external welfare, went seeking after solitude, and devoted themselves to prayer in the monasteries they had founded or enriched with their wealth. Whole families were dispersed amongst various religious houses, and all the severities of penance hardly sufficed to quiet imaginations scared at the perils of living in the world or at the vices of their age. And at the same time, in addition to this outburst of piety, ignorance was decried and stigmatized as the source of the prevailing evils. The function of teaching was included amongst the duties of the religious estate, and every newly founded or reformed monastery became a school, in which pupils of all conditions were gratuitously instructed in the sciences known by the name of liberal arts. Bold spirits began to use the rights of individual thought in opposition to the authority of established doctrines, and others, without dreaming of opposing, strove at any rate to understand, which is the way to produce discussion. Activity and freedom of thought were receiving development at the same time that fervent faith and fervent piety were. The great moral movement of humanity in the 11th and 12th centuries arose from events very different in different parts of the beautiful country, which was not yet, but was from that time forward tending to become, France. Amongst these events, which cannot be here recounted in detail, we will fix upon two, which were the most striking and the most productive of important consequences for the whole history of the epoch: the quarrel of Abélard with St. Bernard, and the crusade against the Albigensians. We shall there see how northern France and southern France differed one from the other before the bloody crisis which was to unite them in one single name and one common destiny. Chapter 18. Part 3.